Come join us as we explore what it means to be the church and study God's purpose and intention for us as the body of Christ in this place.
I know this might come as a bit of a shock to some folks, but running has never really been my thing. I'm not much of... Wait, why are you laughing, Tom? Are you trying to say something? Oh, the Weezer story. That's right. I did tell the Weezer story. You're right. Okay, you get a pass on laughing. No, I've never been much of a runner. I've never understood the concept of running for fun. But I will say Chantel actually has better stories than me when it comes to that, so I'll share one of hers. See, she also has never been one to enjoy running for the sake of running. Well, after college or after high school, she went to a program called Potter's Field Ranch, which we've talked about before. It was a discipleship program for kids who are adults who just graduated high school, but they're trying to find out where's God taking them. Is He taking them into missions? What type of ministry? Anyway, she was in this program, and it involved a lot of physical stuff. You had to do a lot of workouts, exercises, and things because they were hoping to prepare you possibly for ministry and missions in some hard places. Well, that meant her first day there, when they were doing their exercises, they were getting them together and told that they were to run. To which Chantel responded to the director, Pastor Chet, "I don't run unless I don't run unless somebody's chasing me." To which Pastor Chet, who was training to be an Olympic swimmer, who was a very fit guy, who had run from rebels in many different countries, while bullets were, going through the air, he knew how to run. He looked at her and said, "Do you want me to?" And so she ran. She ran. Now, I bring up running because today we're talking a little bit about a race that we're running. The Christian walk is in several places called a race, a run that we're on. And it can be hard to keep running. I know from my own life, it can be hard for me to keep running if I don't have a goal, if I'm just running for fun, if I'm not paying attention to why I am running. And as Christians, people following after the life of Christ, we have a great goal, a reason to run, a person chasing us, if you will, from Chantel's example. There is a reason there. And yet, I know in my own life, it is so easy to stop that race, to just come to a stop. That happens for us. Sometimes we stop in the middle, sometimes we stop before we even get going. Think about it for a moment when you first came to Christ. When you had that fire in your heart for Him. When you wanted to get out there and tell others about what Jesus had done in your life. You were running the race. But then what happens? Well, life happens. You get busy. You get caught up. Your time goes away. You have so many other things. So many distractions come in. And all of a sudden, your Christian life might start looking more like a series of short sprints rather than the race that Paul is talking about here today. Where you go for a while, but you get caught up in things, and so you'll focus on the world and your distractions and things you got to take care of because they need to be taken care of. And then you'll remember, you go to camp or you hear something and it'll remind you, oh, I got to get back to this. And you have your little sprint. But then sure enough, more distractions and things come up that just take you away from that race. And you know what? If you stop, if you just come to a stop, I will tell you this, God will love you. God will still love you. He'll let you stop. But I'll tell you, you're not going to be winning that prize that Paul talks about in the end of chapter 9 here. We won't. So if we're going to walk this life right, once we start, we can't stop. We need to keep our eyes on the prize that Paul talks about here. And today we're talking about what that prize is as we get to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. If you're not there yet, turn there with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 27. What Dan read for us today is what we're going through as Paul is talking about what is that prize that we would run for. Last week we talked about a sort of hard subject, giving up our rights. We don't like to give up rights. They're ours. We want to use them, make use of them. And yet Paul told us, as we read last week, there are times we need to give up some rights in order to do what God has called us to do. So today we're picking up on that to look at the answer to why. Why would we do that? Why would we give up our rights? And as Paul shows us here in chapter 9, well, we give up our rights. We relinquish our rights so that we can reach the lost, like we talked about, and so we can run that race for that prize. And so we'll be looking at those 2 points today, reaching the lost and running the race, as Paul teaches us here. Well, we pick up again where we left off from last week in verse 19 here, as Paul is talking about why we would give up our rights. Now, Paul, we see, he was willing to give up certain rights, and he went pretty crazy on those. If you remember from last week, what right did Paul give up? Gave up the right to receive a salary. He gave up a right to be paid for his work. Not a lot of us would go into our place of employment and say, you know what, don't worry about paying us. We're just going to work without pay. But Paul was willing to do that for the Corinthians. And he also mentioned, he gave up the right to bring along a wife. He gave up a right to choose everything that he wanted to eat or drink. He gave up basic rights. He was willing to be very uncomfortable in order to reach people. And he continues now, getting a little more specific here as we get to verse 19, what that looked like for him as he was dealing with, as he mentions here, those people both under the law and those who are not under the law. But picking up here, 19, he says this, "For though I am free from all," got to remember, he was free from all. He had freedom. He was an apostle. He could take the salary. He could bring the wife along. He could do all the things that he had freedom to do, and he had quite a bit of freedom. He was free from all, but I have made myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. There's his heart there. He had freedom. He had all the freedom we talked about last week. He had freedom to do as he wanted, but he used that freedom in a different way than we might. Instead of using that freedom to take his rights, he used that freedom to give up his rights. See, and it's crazy to hear Paul talk about that, because Paul, we definitely hold up on this sort of pillar as, he's just too good for any of us to get close to, but the same God who saved him, the same Spirit in him is in us, which makes me look at myself and say, wait, I have that freedom too, don't I? I have that freedom in Christ to use that freedom to give up things. So I have to ask myself this question. I ask you this question. How do you use your freedom in Christ? How do you use your freedom? Because the way we use our freedom, it indicates what the gospel really means for us. The way we use our freedom indicates what the gospel really means for us. Do we use our freedom for our own free time, for our own pleasure, for what we want? Or do we use our freedom more like Paul sometimes to say, we're actually free to give up some good things because God has called us somewhere? So I was thinking about that. How is one way that we could actually give up or use our freedom to give up our rights? How does that even work for us? Well, the way it works for us is if we truly trust Jesus, that he makes us free, if he really does make us free, that we can trust him, well, then when we give up some of our rights, we can do that without fear of losing out. That's often why we cling to things, because we don't want to lose out on what's ours. But if Jesus is everything for us, we can have that freedom. So yeah, we saw Paul. Paul, he was willing to give up his salary. Now, if you felt someone calling you to give up your salary, what is probably a response you would have? I know my response that I would have, and my response would typically be, well, no, God, not a good answer. Like, how do I make ends meet then? How do I provide? But if I trust Jesus in what he has called me to do, can I trust him to provide? That's how it works in our lives. When God calls us to something, Jesus will provide. When God calls you, Jesus has it. Jesus has it. He'll cover for you if you will trust him. When God calls you, you can hold to that. And for us, I was thinking of examples, but for us, one way that comes up, I know in my own life, it's trying to be vulnerable. I like putting up walls and looking good and having everything set in order. A lot of us do. Sort of putting your, best foot forward and all of that, but sometimes we do that in relationships, and it keeps us from connecting with people because we're really presenting a false image, a sort of facade of what we are. But if we trust Jesus enough to be enough for us, well, that might be one area where we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable to people, to let them see maybe some of the broken pieces and some of the unpolished areas, because we trust that he is enough for us. Well, I hope you can think of some of your own examples there for yourself, but we have to ask ourselves the question, is Jesus enough for us? Is Jesus enough that we can be free to give up our rights? If we can be, then we can meet people like Paul did. This is the way that he did it. All right, picking up here in verse 20, he explains what this means for him practically. He says, "To the Jews, I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law." You see Paul actually living this out now. He's giving up rights in order to reach people. Now, in this case, he's talking about the Jewish people. He is willing to go ahead and hang on to his Jewish identity when he needs to in order to reach the Jews. And for him, he took that, quite far. That meant for him, when he was with the Jews, reaching out to the Jews, well, for him, pork was off the menu. He kept to the dietary laws. That meant so much to him, that when he was traveling with Timothy, he looked over to poor Timothy and said, "Hey, brother, we're reaching the Jews. You have a date with a knife. It's time to get circumcised." Yes, and it meant for Paul even this. We read about Paul when he's discussing all of his beatings, that he took the 40 lashes minus 1, 39 lashes, 5 times. He received that punishment. And you might hear that and think, wow, he really got beat a lot. What was he doing? But that was a specific punishment. See, in the Jewish law, they had 39 things you could break that would force you out of the community of Israel, to where you would be cut off from the people, either executed or exiled, no longer a part of them. And that is your fate if you break one of them. One of them happened to be blasphemy. And many people claimed that Paul was committing blasphemy and preaching about Jesus. So when this came up, the response of the Jewish people would have been to kick him out of the community. But they had one out. One out. If you choose to go a different route, if you want to stay Jewish, you could take your 40 lashes minus 1. And they would allow you to remain in the community. They would replace execution or exile with that. Which means if Paul's taken it 5 times he is chosen, instead of just leaving the Jews alone, instead of losing that identity, he chose to take those 39 lashes just to hold on to his Jewish identity. That's how far he was willing to go to be a Jew to the Jews in order to reach them. That's incredible. But you see Paul's heart for this. I mean, when you read Acts, you hear how much he gets beaten, how much he gets kicked out, how much people hate him, and it's often his Jewish brothers and sisters doing it to him. To the point where he says, "I'm done. I'm just going to the Gentiles now." Of course, the very next place he goes to the synagogue first, because his heart is for them, and he's willing to do what is needed to be there with them. He was willing to do that. And then we see that, that at least was his own culture. He grew up Jewish. He understood the Jewish rules. He had lived with those Jewish rules. But he was even willing to do that for people outside of his culture. Because we go on here, verse 21, it's not just to the Jews. He says, "To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law." Not only will he live out Jewish principles, all godly, staying godly, but living in a Jewish way in order to reach the Jews, he's willing to live still godly, but as a Gentile to reach the Gentiles. Well, that meant, even though he had lived his entire life living in a society where he was to stay away from those dirty Gentiles, that he would be polluted by eating with them, talking with them, being close to them, he was willing to go among them. He was willing to eat with them. He was even willing to eat their food, which meant giving into their dietary styles. It meant for him giving into those socializing. He had to socialize with them. For him, I find it interesting, it even meant his teaching style had to change a little bit. Could you see Paul, he would often go and preach in the synagogue, but when he was working with Gentiles in these Greek regions, he would actually move to teaching in a Greek way. Renting out a schoolhouse and going ahead and having weekly, daily lessons there. I was thinking about that, and that's as big for him as though if we were to say, all right, well, to reach people here, we're not going to do Sunday school. Instead, we're going to have a week school, or get together during the week time and gather people together. Paul was willing to go that far against his traditions in order to reach those who needed to be reached. And so I was thinking about that. If Paul was willing to do that, what would we be willing to do? What would we be willing to do? He hits the whole spectrum here, all the way from about the most religious conservative folks you could get, the Jews, out to, the crazy, what we would call the crazy heathens out on the other end. And yet he was willing to meet them where they were. It's like, if he's willing to go after the Jews, it might, in our experience, that might be more, equated to going to a very, very religious, conservative, even legalistic side of things and saying, okay, we'll wear our tie. We'll dress up nicely. We'll hide our tattoos. I don't have any, but, I carry a wife around who does. So, we won't show those things off in order to not offend. We'll say the right things in order to not offend. We will stick to the Word of God. We will be faithful to the truth, but we're going to go ahead and adjust cultural outside to be able to love on those who need to be loved. And the same is true on the other end. Those heathens out there, Paul was willing to go out there and be with them, spend time with them. Well, we might look out and call some people heathens, but we need to be willing to be out there as well. Maybe at times, be okay dressing down. Maybe at times, being okay when we hear things we don't want to hear, words we might not like, and yet not jump right to judging. And that includes even judging things that are ungodly, because I'll just tell you something, it doesn't matter what they do, they're condemned to hell. No amount of goodness we can add to them is going to do anything else until they know Jesus Christ, which they will only know by our witness to them. Meaning we got to meet them where they are with that message. Paul was willing to do that. Paul was willing to live a life of extreme giving up of his rights in order to meet people where they were, in order to bring the gospel where it needed to be. As he says here, verse 22, to the weak I became weak. In Paul's mind, weak can mean one of two things. Weak are either young Christians who sort of need help coming on up, or people who simply don't know the truth. He is willing to be weak alongside them. He's willing to be there that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. That's what he was willing to do. Because his eye was on the prize, and that prize was meeting people where they were in order to present that love, to save some, he says. He gave up his rights to reach the lost, and he met people where they were. And what that reminds me of is Jesus. Because we think of Jesus and how he lived his life. Again, as we mentioned several times before, when people saw the way Jesus lived, because he was hanging out with the sinners and the tax collectors, and he was spending time with people who needed him, not people who were like him, but people who needed him, they would whisper about Jesus that he eats with sinners and tax collectors. They even spread rumors about him. Oh, that drunkard. He's a drunkard. Now, do people do that about you because you spend time with people? I don't know if it's always great to have rumors spread about being a drunkard, but can people whisper that about you, that you spend time with sinners and tax collectors? So I know many times I can't say that about myself, because these bubbles we stay in are just so nice, because we can't reach the lost if we cling to our rights. That's a scary part for us. We can't do it when we cling to our rights, because it's so easy to stay inside of our bubbles. I was thinking about this. In the last 20 years, I remember the last 20 years. I'm young, but I can remember the last 20 years. And in these past 20 years, the influence of the church on this culture has just withered away. Now, I remember 20 years ago, church was actually quite a bit all the rage, It was the thing, and it was having an impact. But I'll say, in the last 20 years, a lot of that has withered away. And in many ways, we're not welcome in the public square. It's sad, but it's true. But you know what? Neither was Paul. Paul wasn't. Think of the beatings he received. He was not welcome in the public square, and yet he was out there. All right, well, with a culture like that, with a tendency to cling to our rights and stay in our bubbles. And when I say bubbles, I mean just stay within our communities. Do everything with like-minded people and only like-minded people. What do we need to do? And that's going to be different for us than it was for Paul, but we need to have the same heart of willingness that Paul had. Because it's not just about, giving up rights, making it clear the suffering we have so that we can be martyrs for our cause, saying, look at the state of Christianity in America, look at the state of Christianity in our time, woe is us. That's not the point. What's needed for us is to see that this has a purpose and to make sure we keep our eyes on that prize, because our rights, when we cling to them, can keep us from meeting non-believers. So we got to hand some of those over. We got to be willing to do that. We got to be able to meet them where they are. Meet with people, even people we have problems with, even people we don't like. We're still called out to do that and meet them with the love of Christ. So the question that really hit me as I was pondering this was, how many non-Christians do I have in my circle? And in circle, I mean your acquaintances, your friends. I will say your inner circle, your inner acquaintance, those people who have access to your soul, access to your heart, those people should be Christians. Those should be like-minded Christians who will be able to build you up. But when we talk about our broader circle, friends, close friends, acquaintances, all of that, how many of those are not Christian? How many of those need to hear the truth? The hope is that, sort of like Paul, we could have a wider circle of people around us, friends, connections, who don't know Christ, so that we might be able to share it with them. Because those are the ones we are called to. Those are the ones that God calls us to in order to save some. Now, you could be cynical, and I'm a cynical person, so I can understand being cynical. You could be cynical and just simply say, why? Why should we care? We're comfortable in our own circles. We're comfortable in what we have. Why would we expose ourselves to being uncomfortable? Well, I would simply point out what Paul points out next. We do that because that's what it means to run this race. That is what it means to run the race. As we get to these verses, 24 through 27, I do find that this is, I think, an area that might be misquoted sometimes for us, because we read these verses, and often what we get out of it is that Paul's talking about how do we live a good Christian life where we're self-controlled and making ourselves pure and holy in front of everyone and look like good Christians. How do we make ourselves look like good Christians that we can put ourselves on display before everyone to say, hey, look, there's a good Christian, because they're, holy and bright and all that stuff. But the race that he's talking about isn't a race to be holy in front of God here. Now, we should be. Not saying that we shouldn't be, but that's not the race that he's talking about. It's not a race to be holy in front of God, because you need to come to grips with the fact that you are holy before God. You are righteous before God in the righteousness of Christ. And you can't actually do anything to add to that righteousness before God, and you can't do anything to take away from that righteousness before God, because that righteousness isn't yours, it's Christ's. But the race that Paul is talking about here, it is a race to do everything you need to do to reach those people around you. That's the race that he's talking about here. Well, we start here, verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. All right, Paul's using a sport metaphor here. I'm not a huge fan of sport metaphors throughout my running, but usually it's because I can't run, not because of how well I do. Paul is using it, though, in a positive light, speaking of the sports of his day. In his day, they had the games, whether that be Olympic or Isthmus or any of the other games that they would have. They had these big games that everybody was excited to be a part of. And if you wanted to be an athlete in these games, you had to give up your rights. It was actually very rigid. If you wanted to run in one of these games, you had to sign away 10 months of your life. Sign away 10 months of your life to a trainer who was certified, who would then have complete control over your life. He would tell you when to wake up. He would tell you what you were going to do that day. He would tell you what you were going to eat and when you were going to bed. He controlled all of your life. These athletes had quite a bit of self-control. They stuck to this for 10 months in order to race in these games. These athletes had rigorous lives. That's what he's talking about here. And they did all of that for this crown. We have it down here in the ESV, wreath. Stephanos there was it was just a wreath of leaves. Sometimes even dead leaves were given out as the crown, not worth hardly anything other than the glory that they brought. But Paul says we're racing for something quite a bit better. Not this perishable crown, but an imperishable crown. So what is this crown that Paul's talking about here? It's probably a good thing to know so we understand what he's talking about. So he says that we run for this imperishable crown. That's our goal. That's our prize. Well, I had to jump in and see what he's talking about. Like this word here, it is the word Stephanos, usually translated crown. It's where we get the name Stephen from. And we find it used quite a bit in the New Testament. One area is in the gospel writers. As they're writing, they bring up crowns. You can probably imagine where that comes up, in the crown of thorns. That's the Stephanos of Christ, the crown of thorns that he wore there at the crucifixion. If we look a little forward, we can see John use that word quite a bit in the book of Revelation. As we get there, it indicates authority, either worldly or spiritual, but authority. How does Paul use it, though? Because he uses this word a few times. Well, we find in Philippians 4:1, where he's talking about this. He says to the Philippians, "Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved." So we're thinking, okay, an idea, crown here. He's referring to the church of Philippi as his crown. Now we'll continue on here. Another time he uses it is in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 2:19 through 20. "For what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at his coming? What is the crown? What is the Stephanos? Is it not you? For you are our glory and joy." What's the crown that he's talking about here? Well, if I'm reading this in context with how Paul uses the ideal of crown, he's not talking about gaining some righteousness of his own here, and holiness is involved with it all, but it certainly looks like what he's talking about is something far more tangible to us right now. Your crown that you race for are those people you meet with and share the gospel with. Those people who may actually come to know Christ because of your testimony. That is a crown. Paul's racing for that crown. Paul's racing for the people who need to hear his message. See, that's the image. Laying aside our rights, being willing to live with self-control, not self-control that we can, constantly be more holy. Again, that's not saying that's bad. That's not his point here. Self-control that allows you to say, I can give up this, and I can give up this right, and I can do without that right because I trust Jesus, and he's calling me to somebody, and I'm going to go to that person no matter what it takes, no matter the cost. I'm willing to do that. That is the race, as Paul is talking about here. So are we doing that? Is that a race that we're running? Are we running for that crown? Are we running for the crown that are people out there who need to hear that good news? Now I'll say this is not like racking up converts, and sort of, adding numbers to your tally to say how good of a Christian you are. We used to joke about this at Moody when I was there in Chicago during our comedy nights. We're big, always big into street evangelism. And so we would make these mock, sports cards, for each other that would have how many salvations we had in a season. So you could say, oh, look, he had 127 decisions. Yeah, well, in last season, this guy got 150. We joke about that. That's not what Paul's talking about here. It's not about a numbers game. It's simply meeting those people that God has for you to meet. It's letting those people see your faith and telling your story to people who need to hear it. And it doesn't mean that it has to be astronomical numbers. It's simply who he calls you to. But I will say, if you want to fail this race, if you don't want to run like Paul, all you got to do, it's really easy. All you got to do, cling to your rights, and keep to yourself. Hang on to those rights, keep to yourself, and you'll do a good job failing that race. But I would hope that would not be our desire. But continuing on here, verse 26, Paul says, "So I do not run aimlessly." This is important. He wants that crown. He wants to be able to rejoice in people who've heard the gospel through his life. So he has a purpose. He has a goal. So he does not run aimlessly. "I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body," literally beat my body, "and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Now, Paul here, he was going to do what he needed to do. He was willing to give up his rights to reach the lost. And it took self-control because it meant laying aside good things that he wanted. Good things. But he was willing to give them up. Otherwise, what he'd end up doing is preaching a message he didn't live. He'd end up preaching a message without actually going out there and living out the gospel in other people's life. So if you've accepted this gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, it will be at work in you. It will be at work in you, and it will be encouraging you to tell others. So what is the gospel? We've gone over it, and we'll go over it again. The gospel is this, and that we are all hopelessly sinful and lost. But God loved us so much that he sent his only Son, Jesus Christ, to earth to become man and to live the perfect life we were supposed to live, and in doing so, show us the way. That he died the death that we deserved to open the way to God, and that he rose again in victory in order to lead the way into that life. And if we accept that by faith, his life becomes ours. And we can live in the eternal life of Christ right now, and we can rejoice in that going into eternity. And if that's alive in us, if that truly is alive in us and at work, then that should compel us to share. That should compel us to love others and reach out. That should be at work in us. Now, if it's not at work in you, I don't know, maybe you're going through a time where you've been backsliding. Maybe you're going through a time of a dark valley and you're just not there. Maybe you've been sitting in church a while and you know what? You've never actually accepted that completely. Maybe intellectually you said sure, but you never actually let that become true for you and lived that out, accepting that by faith. Either way, I would say, if that's not at work, then you probably need to go to Jesus, and I would encourage you to do that. Go before him and ask him what's up and what he would have for you. What this will look like in practice is it will look like you out there, reaching out to people, showing them the love of Christ and seeing lives changed around you. Now, maybe you don't know how. Maybe it's like how do I do this? I'll give you a really simple way this morning. Last week I said, think of one right that you cling to too much. I said, think about that. What is one right that if God asks you to give up, you would look at him square in the eyes and say, no, I can't do that, God. Because I think that'd be one for you to be addressing with him, talking with him about. But today, I want you to ask God about something a little different. I want you to ask God that he would give you one person. All right, one person. I found this is one prayer that just seems to be answered all too often in the morning, and go before God and say, God, just give me one person today, one person that I can encourage, one person that I can share with in some way. And inevitably, somebody shows up in my life that God says, this is your one, go for it. And then it's up for me whether or not I'm going to listen to him. That might require giving up some rights. It often does for me. But the Lord will call us to those things if we ask him. And so, I've tried to do that, and I've seen it at work, and I would encourage you to do the same. And what happens is, when you see that at work, when you pray that prayer, and you see God bring someone into your life, and you respond in that way, you share with them, you love them, it wakes something up inside of you to say, oh, wait, this is what I'm called to. This is a purpose that God has given to me, and it gets you more excited for the next one. But it does require giving up of rights at times. Now, I was thinking of one right that I cling to. I mentioned it before, but I do deal with quite a bit of social anxiety, and so one right I like to hold on to is my right to be comfortable in myself. And that's one right that I thought about last week. I like to be comfortable not talking with people, not going out to a stranger and addressing them, because I just don't like doing that. It fills me with anxiety. But I got to give them my right to be comfortable there. And so if I'm asking God to give me that one person, I got to be willing to give up some rights in order to meet them wherever they might be. So I would encourage you this week to do that. Go before God in the morning, and I would say tomorrow morning, say, God, give me one person today, and see what he'll do if you'll step out in faith in this. And you might say, hey, I can't do that. I don't have enough time. I got too many things to do, too many distractions. And I would just say, let God be God of your time and your rights for this. So, relinquish your rights, reach the lost, and run this race. So that, here's our hope, when you've run this race and you're ready to rest, you're ready to lay down the work and rest, you'll hear the Father say to you, well done, my good and faithful servant.